Welcome to STEM-E Interviews. This is the first episode of many in our STEM-E interview series. I am Kashvi Singhal and I am the Digital Media Specialist of STEM-E.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Broun. I'm a joint venture business analyst at Chevron, and prior to this, I was working as a geophysicist with Chevron.
Okay, my first question for you is, can you take us through your background, like where you started and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So when I was going through school, I was one of those people who really had no idea what I wanted to do. I tried to just keep every option open that I possibly could to try and delay having to make that decision. So I always loved math and science. They were absolutely two passion subjects for me. So what I did when I graduated was I decided to go and do a mechanical engineering degree and take math and physics. So I did that throughout the program, and I found it to be, really intellectually, really challenging, but really fascinating. And I decided to take a job in the engineering field, really because that seemed to be what most people were doing. So a lot of people, they would come in through school, take an engineering degree, and then graduate as an engineer. So I did engineering and I was hired on by Chevron as a drilling engineer. And this was a really amazing job. I got to work on offshore semi-submersible drilling rigs. My average day would be, I would go out to the airport, we would fly, 3 hours to the north of Australia. We would then get a helicopter and we would fly out to the rig where I would live for 3 weeks. Doing offshore engineering, and then later in my career, I did more of the drill site managing. Now, all the time that I was out there floating around in the sea, drilling wells, it really bothered me because I never could understand why some wells were successful. Sometimes we found hydrocarbons and sometimes we didn't. And, I wanted to understand why. I thought it was so amazing that we were able to, move our rig to a tiny little spot on the earth and drill down and suddenly find oil or gas. So what I wanted to do was know more about that. And I started getting really interested in what it was that we were drilling. So I actually was really lucky. I spoke and we were able to get a job in the operations geosciences group. And that's kind of a role that's halfway between drilling and halfway between geophysics. And we were able to then start to transition on that journey to becoming a geophysicist. And I will say that in order to make that transition, I did go and take a master's degree in the geosciences, just so that I could fully top up on the subject. Once I got back from doing my master's degree, I worked in exploration geophysics, and I spent about 5 years exploring on the northwest shelf of Australia. And this was one of the best roles I've had. I really, really loved it. I was really fascinated by trying to try new things and trying to, chase and discover hydrocarbon. After doing the exploration role, I was then given a position here in the US, and I came to Houston as an operations geophysicist and worked in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico. And for me personally, the deepwater Gulf of Mexico is one of the premier basins that you can work around the world. It's something that you hear all the time as a geoscientist, and it was really an amazing opportunity to be able to come and learn that basin and see how wells get drilled and how prospects get, discovered over here.
As a high schooler who also doesn't know what to do in the future, that really reassures me.
Yeah, it's not a straight line.
Yeah. So I heard that you said that you moved from Australia to Houston. So how was that for you, professionally and personally?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And So one of the things that I have found throughout my career that I really enjoy is that you start to build up a family. And when you're working in geophysics, it's a small function, and you do start to get to know people who live all over the world. And when I came to Houston, it meant that transition was so much easier because I already had some contacts here. I had some friends. I had been to Houston previously. So it made everything a lot easier. And when you have that common language and common interest in geophysics, I think it just makes it all the more better. And the really neat thing is that you can bring things that you do in Australia that work well there, and maybe they haven't used them here, and then they're able to teach me, all of the new wonderful things that I can learn. So it's been a great opportunity, both personally and professionally. So I have to say, the Houston summer, I'm still not 100% sold on that. So that's probably the only downside.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you said that you used to work in geophysics. So I know you kind of explained what this is, but can you go into more in depth about what geophysics actually is?
Yeah, so geophysics is essentially using physics to study what's underneath the earth. And we can do this using a whole different way of techniques. I mean, obviously we can't drill down and we can't look at all of the rocks. So we have to come up with remote ways that we're able to come to an understanding of what's beneath the earth. And this is really important for understanding things like volcanoes or earthquakes. For me, we use it in the petroleum business, but it's got many implications, even trying to just understand the forces that drive our planet and plate tectonics. So there's still so much that we're learning about it all the time. And you can really, when you think about geophysics, there's a lot of different techniques. We have, for example, like gravity that we can use. You can use magnetics to survey. We use sound waves in the petroleum business. So we essentially study how sound waves move through the earth. And if you're ever, say you're sitting in a room talking, some of that sound energy, it's going to go through the wall into the room next to you. And some of it's going to reflect off and, be reflected. So what we do is we essentially create the sound waves that go down, and every time there's a different layer of rock, you're going to get the same effect. You're going to get some of that sound energy is going to reflect and it's going to come back up. And we listen for that, and we're going to be recording, and some of it's going to travel down and it's going to hit the next layer. So geophysics is all about how you can take this information that you've surveyed and how you can put it all back together to build up a picture of the earth. And I find it amazing that we can do it for, miles and miles beneath the earth, and you can make some really spectacular images.
I find that super interesting.
Yeah.
So, what do geophysicists do daily?
Yeah, so when you think about geophysicists, there are really three different buckets that they can fall in. So at the front end, you have the people that do the acquisition. So the acquisition are the people out there who are, doing the survey. They're the ones that are actually on a boat if you're offshore. And if you're on a boat, which I've had the pleasure of visiting, you are on a huge vessel for, many weeks at a time, and you're dragging along, miles of, they call them hydrophones, but they're essentially the little microphones that are listening for all of the sound waves coming back. And these are the people that are, quite adventurous, and they go out to a lot of remote locations and they take these surveys. So that's kind of one side, that's the acquisition. And then the next step would be the processing. So these are people, if you really love math and physics and you really like getting into the detail, these are the people that take the data from the boats or from the trucks, and they put it all back together and they recreate the earth. And it's a really incredible process to watch. And then you have the third bucket, which is where I spend most of my time, and that's as the interpreter. So I receive the picture, the image that comes from the processing, And I use that to try and understand, okay, so what are the processes that are driving this area? What's the geology like? What should I expect? Where might there be something prospective to go and look for?
Can people like switch between like some of those different paths, or do you have to like stick to one?
You can switch, and I do know people who have switched between all of them. One thing that you will find as you work through the career is that no one person is ever going to be able to do everything. There's always something for you to learn. And I think that's what keeps the job really, really fascinating. Even sitting in the generalist bucket, if you're doing your seismic interpretation, you're still having to work with reservoir engineers and geologists and production engineers and drilling engineers and petrophysicists, and there's just a whole wide range of people that you need to speak to. And because of that, you're always learning. And I think because of that, it never really gets bored.
Yeah. So what is the difference between a drilling engineer and a geophysicist?
Yeah, so drilling engineering is all about how we're going to drill a hole that will enable us to perform the work that we need to do. So a drilling engineer, there's two different types. One of them will be in the office, and they'll be doing all of the detailed design work, working with stresses and loads and forces. And then you'll have the drilling engineers that will work offshore. And they're the ones that make sure that everything that's going in the well is correct. They make sure that all of the well site calculations are performed, and they're really, really active in the day-to-day life of the rig. So when you compare the drilling space to geophysics, it's really quite different. Geophysics is all about using those reflected sound waves, using seismic data in order to try and build the image of the picture of the Earth. And where the two meet, they do meet, and it's when you actually start to drill the well. And sometimes they can actually have to work together very, very closely, because as a geophysicist, and I've worked in this role, when you're doing operations, your job is to, look at the hazards that might be encountered and, communicate with your drilling engineer and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing in the seismic. This might be what's coming up in the next section. We need to make sure that we're prepared for it and that we design the well properly. So while initially they appear to be two very, very different functions, they actually rely on each other greatly. And on a day-to-day experience, so working as that offshore drilling engineer, you're able to get all of that information about how the well is progressing, if you're having any problems in the well, and you're then able to talk with the geophysicist who might also be working that well with you, and they have the understanding of all of the geology and of what might be coming up in the section. So it's a great question. Two things that seem very, very separated can be very, very integral to each other.
So would the transition from a drilling engineer to a geophysicist not be that hard?
So it was difficult. They are two separate functions, and I think if you have a good understanding of one, it definitely makes it easier to do the transition, but it's not something that I would say would be common.
Okay. So why did you decide to work in the geophysics industry? I think you kind of mentioned this earlier, but...
Yeah, so for me, it was all about the curiosity of trying to understand what it was that we were drilling for. And as I started getting further in my understanding, it really pulled together my science background that I had from college. So it really pulled in the physics and the math that I did. And I found that it enabled me to be very creative, but at the same time, justifying that hypothesis with actual science. And I found that to be a really, really engaging, powerful combination.
Yeah, so you said that you traveled a lot, right? So where have you been exactly?
So when I was doing the drilling project and going to visit seismic vessels, so that's going out onto, getting offshore, going really remote places. I did that on the northwest shelf of Australia. We got to visit, some beautiful islands up there. We did a lot of training in Bangkok, so I spent a fairly significant amount of time in Thailand, and obviously now in Houston.
That's super cool. I love traveling.
Yeah.
How and why did you transition into a business analyst?
Yeah, so part of when you're working in exploration, a lot of the time you're thinking about new ventures, and new ventures is something that I really enjoy. It's when you try and look for what the next opportunity might be. And maybe you have a new idea that no one has thought of before, and you go out and you find the evidence to try and support your idea, and you're able to build something. You might be successful in bidding for some blocks, and then you might be able to go out and drill, and maybe you'll have a discovery that could lead to something really impactful. So for me, I really enjoyed building a new opportunity. So when it came time to maybe look for something new, stepping into business, into the business analyst role is really a similar process. It's looking for opportunities. It's looking for what's going to complement your portfolio and trying to be a little bit strategic in how you think. And most of those lessons I actually learned from being a geophysicist and doing some new ventures work.
So was the transition hard from becoming like a geophysicist to a business analyst? Because they sound like very different.
So transitions are always interesting. I think it's where you grow and develop most quickly. And I've had several transitions from engineering to operations to exploration and now into business. So I think that they're an incredible time for you to learn a lot very, very quickly. And if you're able to keep making some changes, and you'll just keep learning, and it will make you better.
Yeah. What was it like switching through many different internships and jobs in different fields?
I think you have to be mindful of the job that you're doing and what it is that you want, and really try and keep in perspective maybe what that end goal will be. And it doesn't mean that you have to be prescriptive. So for me, I never ever would have thought that I would be sitting in a business analyst role at this time in my career. But when you think about what the next logical step might be, and you think about what your interests are, I think you may not always find a linear path. Sometimes your path will be different, but still just as rewarding and interesting. So I guess I was open to a lot of different opportunities along the way. And I was not that prescriptive in exactly how I wanted to go from A to B to C. And because of that, I've been able to see a wide number of things, and it really does come in handy to have that broad base.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What do you like about your profession?
So I have to say, I love it. I love the curiosity. I love that you have the full ability to go out and explore and think things that someone hasn't thought of before, because maybe one time it'll be a game changer. And then you can bring all of the science and all of the geophysics in, and you can use that in creative ways to try and really say, hey, this is some value that we can add, and you can make your story for why you think that that's a place that's going to have resource.
Yeah. And on the other side, what do you dislike, if anything?
So for me personally, I really like the role, because if I stay doing one thing for too long, I can find that I do get a little bit tired of that. So the joy of geophysics is that because you're always working with different people and you're always taking in different ideas, it means that you've always got an opportunity to develop your skills in different areas or within geophysics itself, because it is such a broad discipline. So I think that, yeah, any anytime that you might be thinking, hey, I'm starting to stagnate, I mean, an opportunity to learn something new is just right around the corner, because everyone has a different background and a different skill set, and they all have something to teach you.
Yeah. Okay. What is the importance of geophysics in your opinion?
Oh, so you look at how the earth shapes so many people's lives. I mean, you look at how people monitor and live with volcanoes, you look at earthquakes, you look at tsunamis. I mean, it's an important piece of understanding for safety, and as well as then trying to, explore and find and develop these fields of oil and gas that are going to be used to power nations. It's not just for gas or for power, it's also for making, textiles and chemicals and plastics, and it touches, so many different facets of life.
How many different types of sciences do you need to know for geophysics? Is it just physics, or is there more to it?
There's a lot of different ways in. So you can, anything with math, anything with physics. I even know geologists that have gone into geophysics. So it's very broad, very welcoming community, and no one has a perfect background. So there's always things that you'll be strong at and things that you can share.
What are some challenges you faced?
Yeah, so I think the main challenges have been around the career trajectory and trying to understand how do you start putting some moves together and what makes sense. And I think that if you're able to think about your skills and what you can bring to the next role, you may not have 100% of the skill set of the role that you're trying to apply for. But if you can bring a significant percentage with you, then you have a strong base to start from, and you can learn the rest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you consider to be some of the rewarding things from your job?
So for me, it's the people. Wherever you go in the world, it's the people that you meet, and you make those really special connections. And if you have a lot of people who are all passionate about the same thing, and you can have geophysicists talking about geophysics for hours. I mean, really, I've seen it. But it's great to be in a role that you're passionate about, and you can share that passion with others, and then you can build up that community, and it's just really, really makes it a pleasure.
Yeah, that sounds really, really nice. If I'm a middle or high schooler interested in pursuing geophysics, what advice would you give me to get started?
Yeah, so I would just make sure that you're interested in the sciences, and you don't have to be the best at them. You don't have to, necessarily take all of them. Just make sure that it's something that you're genuinely interested in. And I think if you have that background and the curiosity, then you'll go a long way. And, I certainly did not get into geophysics through a traditional geophysics undergraduate degree. But if you have a strong skill set in those maths and physics type units, then you'll find a way.
Related to that previous question, how would you recommend them getting started?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources out there. So if you're interested, USGS has some great things on their website. There's some really good talks on YouTube that you can listen to. Just be interested, take notice of earthquakes, volcanoes, understand plate tectonics, just have an interest in the world around you and how we use science to understand it.
Okay, that's a really good piece of knowledge. And what is your advice to parents of students who want to pursue geophysics?
I would say do as much as possible to keep your children interested, keep them learning, keep them motivated to learn more about the world around them. And if there are opportunities to be engaged in any of the community events or university days where you can go down and see some of the geophysical departments that they might have, I would recommend something along those lines.
Yeah. So I noticed that you mentioned creativity in your answers. So does creativity play a role in geophysics?
It absolutely does. If you're an explorer, you have to be the first person to think differently, to understand a new play. So there's a lot of examples of companies that they may have had blocks for many, many years. And, perhaps they've just missed the best opportunity. And then another company will come in and they'll drill a well and they'll have a huge impactful discovery. And the reason for that is because they were able to think differently. They had a different hypothesis and they were brave and they were willing to try. And because of that, they've unlocked some incredible projects. So whenever you are sitting and you're thinking about exploration, you always have to think in the back of your mind, like, what could be different? Maybe there's something new, and how could I try and explore that? And as you're having these thoughts, that's when you draw on your geophysics, because you may have an idea, but you're going to need some kind of proof. And the way that you get that proof is through geophysics. And there's a lot of techniques that you can do. You can make some models, you can do some what if analysis, and you can really use that to try and either, find support, or maybe it's not your hypothesis. So it's a really nice way to combine that creative portion with the sciences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What should you do to be successful in this field?
I think on a similar line, always keep learning. When you do work across different basins on different projects, every time you go from one project to another, you'll learn something. If you work for a different team, you'll learn more. And if you're able to see more, you learn the most. So I would just say always keep an open mind and always keep learning and never stop asking questions.
And if I want to pursue geophysics, what college major should I pursue?
So obviously your first choice, if it's available, would be geophysics. However, it's not your only choice. I mean, don't feel locked in by that. There are plenty of people who are able to get in through, if you do mathematics, if you do physics, if you have other science degrees, if you have geology. Don't feel like you have to take that as an undergraduate to necessarily follow up with a career path. Obviously, you can probably get some career guidance from your career counselors, but certainly in my experience, strong quantitative skills will get you a very long way.
What are some other paths for geophysicists other than like oiling and drilling?
So I obviously have the most experience with the oil and gas career path because that's the one that I chose, but there's a whole range of opportunities. I know that it's at the very beginning and at its infancy, but there are some carbon sequestration projects that are going on in the world, and they require the use of geophysicists to see how the carbon is flowing through the reservoirs. It's also possible to go and to study, volcanology, seismology, try and understand the processes in the earth. Mineral exploration is another really good one, and that's an opportunity to get involved in trying to identify, mineral deposits. And of course, then there's people who are interested in deep research and trying to really understand the processes that shape our world. And there's still so much that we don't know. It's a very new field relatively.
Yeah. So another question I had for you is, what are your future goals?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And I think when you start to build up your career narrative, sometimes you have to look a little bit backwards to think where might be a next place to go forward. And for me, you also have to pair in there what it is that you enjoy. So for me, I enjoy being creative, using science, and trying to add impactful value anywhere I can. And when you start to think about your career like that, it really opens up, because it's not necessarily just one thing or one position, but it's a whole range. So whether it's back in exploration, whether it's another role in business, I think that there's a lot of opportunities. where you can find something that will fit what will make you happy and what makes sense. So not sure, we'll have to check in a few years.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching this interview. Thank you, Sophie, for your time and giving us an inside view into geophysics. If you all want to learn more, check out the description. Be sure to subscribe. Watch our next edition coming up soon. And Sophie will also be presenting at our STEMI Talk engineering workshop on April 17th. So be sure to register using the link in the description. Thank you all.